All right. Mike Parzi, and the date is August 1st, 2026, coming to you here. And I want to talk about the Fed. Basically, we need to talk about the Fed. I said like a second ago that it's 2026. It's been 18 years since the 2008 crisis. And what happened in the 2008 crisis, people? Well, the Fed started paying interest on excess reserves. And it's been 5 years since 2021. And how long has it been? 5 years since the Fed started paying interest on reserve balances. That's all reserve balances in the banking system. You have to remember that prior to 2008, back in 2007, when the 30-year bond was as high as it is right now, what happened? Okay, what happened? We had a huge recession, right? The 2008 crisis, after the bond market got as high as it is today. Well, look, back then, the reason the Fed funds rate was adjusted was because it's an upper bound, right? And so there was no excess reserves in the system whatsoever. Well, quantitative easing, people, it's been 18 years. Quantitative easing. Hello, we need to realize now that Fed policy has been completely changed for the past 5 years. You could argue for the past 18 years. And we're still talking like the Fed still has the power to control inflation and employment. Come on, let's get to it. Like prices will go up because banks create more deposits in the system. All right. Now they have to have reserves in order to lend money out, you know, and do their bank private credit thing. Not private credit, bank private credit, but okay, they can create deposits. Now they can also use the reserves, which are part of their equity, to pay their employees, buy buildings, things that they're allowed to do, not things that they're disallowed to do. They can use their reserves, turn them into deposits, and spend them on executive salaries, whatever. Okay, so this is a really important thing to think about because to what extent, I got this written down here, okay? I got this written down. The Fed continually expands reserve balances through interest payments that exceed its long-run inflation objective. Okay, right now, today, it's 3.65%. So all reserves in the banking system are getting an interest of 3.65%. So the Fed is increasing the reserves in the banking system at 3.65% per year. All right, I'm just going to dumb it down for you guys. Okay, so if the Fed continually expands reserve balances through interest payments exceeding long-run inflation objectives, to what extent is monetary policy itself relying on private credit restraint, the bank's not creating more deposits, rather than rather than restraint in the growth of government liabilities themselves. Okay, in other words, what I'm saying there is government liabilities are no longer just treasury bonds. They're no longer notes and bills and bonds from the treasury. The reserves themselves pay an interest that costs the government, okay? And then it's just how far out on the maturity ladder do you go down the yield curve there to figure out, well, what's the inflation risk from that duration, and what other risks I want a guaranteed income, for the duration of the bond, yes. I want to be able to ladder it or get coupon payments, but what rate should I get for risking the maturity of that loan. So all of it, including the reserves themselves, now are government liabilities. Okay, so I think I already went over that. Banks cannot spend reserve balances directly, right? Obviously, you need deposits, that are worth dollars to spend reserve deposits directly. There's a one-to-one between reserves and deposits, but it's the bank creates deposits. The reserves are between the Treasury, the central bank, the Fed, and the commercial banks. Okay, so the reserves used to be there in order to restrain the banks, to keep reserves as low as possible. And that's why you would raise the interest rate. If you raise the Fed funds rate, it reduces that restraint. Well, I'm talking about pre 2008. Okay, I'm talking about 2007 and before. Okay, it's not like that anymore. Ever since the Fed entered into its abundant reserve regime, okay, which is 2008, the banks have more reserves than needed. There's plenty of reserves in the system. Raising the rate isn't restricting the excess reserves that the banks have in the system. There's no effect on employment. There's no effect on inflation. Okay? If the Fed raises or lowers its Fed funds rate. Now, what happened is they started paying interest on excess reserves, and in 2021 they started paying interest on all reserves. Okay, so now that's how they're setting their fundamental rate. It's 10 basis points below the Fed funds rate. Okay, and what's the effective Fed funds rate? It's about 3.65% with the Fed funds rate at 3.75%. Well, that means that the banks are earning a profit off of just having reserves, okay, for the past 5 years. All right. Now, I never heard about that anywhere else, but if you've ever heard about it either, you're hearing it now, because go check it out for yourself. That's what they do. So now, if the Fed inflation target rate is 2%, and they're growing reserves in the banking system at a minimum of 3.65%, how serious